Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michelle Hewitt, and I'm the co-chair of the leadership team of Disability Without Poverty. And I'm our host for today's event, the basics of the Canada Disability Benefit. I'm also a woman with disabilities and some limited mobility, a number of pieces of paper and some technology to shuffle. So please bear with me while I make sure I have the right pieces in front of me. Before we begin with the webinar, I'm going to go over our accessibility components and the agenda for today. Please note that throughout the event, we will have the chat closed to the public as it can be disruptive to the other participants. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, you will be able to send a chat message to the hosts and panelists. For all questions that you have, please put those in the Q&A box, usually at the bottom of your screen. We'd greatly encourage you to share your questions, as we will be responding to as many as we can live during our conversation today. Our meeting today features simultaneous English and French translation, LSQ and ASL interpretation, English and French captioning. Please take a moment to adjust your settings as appropriate. First, please select your preferred language, English or French. You do this by selecting the interpretation option on your Zoom menu. Once you select this option, you will not need to change language settings again during the presentation. You must select a language, even if you want to hear this presentation in English. If you are using a mobile device, such as a phone or a tablet, you can find the language interpretation options under More. For those who require ASL or LSQ interpretation, we will be spotlighting those components throughout the presentation. No need to do anything. These will automatically remain on your screen. To enable captions, select the captions option on your Zoom menu. If you would like to adjust the size and the placement of these captions, you will need to go into your Zoom accessibility settings. If we can support you during this presentation, please send us a message in the chat box and someone will assist you. So, to summarize our accessibility options, please select your language using the interpretation option, enable captions if required, and finally, make sure to share your questions in the Q&A box. Our team members are on hand to help you with any technical difficulties you may be experiencing. And I would just like to reach out with my thanks to the technical team that are behind this and the accessibility team that we have to make sure that we can all enjoy this webinar. So, first of all, let me recognize that we are on the ceded and unceded traditional territories across the country of Turtle Island that belongs to our Indigenous peoples. Particularly, I recognize that I am an uninvited settler on the ceded and ancestral territory of the Okanagan-Silex First Nation. So to now give a brief overview of our session. First of all, I'm going to give a little recap of what we talked about in our previous webinar, if you were with us for that was to do with the basics of a bill, and it came from Senator Brett Cotter. After that, I'm going to introduce you to our guest today, and who is Professor Jennifer Robson, and we are going to work through a number of questions related to the Canada Disability Benefit, its design, and the sorts of things we can expect to see it. This webinar is brought to you by Disability Without Poverty, and I'm very proud to be involved with this organisation. We have been working on this Canada Disability Benefit since it was announced in the throne speech of 2020. We believe that this is an opportunity that is life-altering for so many disabled people, and we are working so hard to do all we can through the complexity of the processes that face us to make this the best possible benefit it can be for all. At times it feels like a slow, rocky road, but with all of us pulling together, I'm sure that we can make great change. So first of all, to just go through some of the basics of a bill. First of all, and the specific bill we're talking about here has a number C22. You may think that perhaps I've got that number wrong. Wasn't it C35? Well, yes, it was. But that bill happened before our federal election.
Yeah. Okay, excellent.
And any bills that are still on the table when an election is called are wiped off and have to start again. As some of you know, our bill was tabled. I feel the ownership of it. It's all of our bill, all of us in the disability community. So our bill, C22, the Canada Disability Benefit Bill, was tabled earlier before the summer in June. And it got what was called first reading. That literally means that it was presented, and it was presented in the House of Commons. This is a bill. Everybody went away for summer holiday. Over the summer, we were all waiting anxiously to find out when it would get to what's next was called second reading. So that's the time when it's presented again into the House of Commons, and that the bill gets a chance to get more debate. We found out on Friday that that was happening on Tuesday. So I'm sure many of you, along with us, were frantically making sure that we could invite as many people as possible to see this happen. And many of you, I know, took part in our Twitter storm, because we had almost 9,000 tweets of our hashtag CDB by 23. So we went through Tuesday, and we had hoped, all of us, that by the end of that day, there would have been a vote, and that vote didn't happen. So we're now waiting for that vote to happen. Hopefully it will be really soon. When it does take place, and presuming it passes, and there was nothing that we heard on Tuesday that wouldn't lead us to believe it was going to pass, well, then it moves off into committee. This stage is where the bill, any bill, is sent off to the relevant committee. And for ours, it's the HUMA committee, H-U-M-A, and I'm sure Jen can probably help me with that acronym later. In that committee, anyone, any of us, can ask to speak to the committee, or we can send in recommendations, written presentations. So once this vote happens, which hasn't happened yet, then it will move off to committee. Once the committee is finished, then reports are written, and the report goes off to the House of Commons again, where it gets its third reading. At this point, people can request changes that are made. MPs can request changes that are made. Once we leave that, hopefully with a successful vote in favour of the Canada Disability Benefit, then it goes to the Senate, and the whole process happens again. First reading, second reading, with a vote, off to the Senate committee, their report stage, their third reading, and then finally, after that, we hope that it becomes a law, that it receives what's called royal assent. So, as you can see, at the moment, we are at the start of a journey. We are really at the start of making this bill pass its way through the House of Commons and then onto the Senate. After that comes something called regulations. And really, it's the regulations that Jen and I are going to talk to you about today. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Professor Jennifer Robson. Professor Jennifer Robson is an associate political management at Carleton University. And I had the honor earlier this year of being invited to join one of her classes as an invited guest. And it was a wonderful experience. You can see the rigor that she applies to all her courses, and you can see the respect that all her students give her. Outside that, I'm also grateful for Jen's friendship and her support on all that we do at DWP when we get into the nitty-gritty. I have a group that I call my wise women, and whenever I get into any of my more complicated questions, those are the women I reach out to help me understand the research and the deeper issues that are behind making the Canada Disability benefit all of the disability community. She's also previously worked in nonprofits and worked for government. So she brings this wealth of experience to us today. And I'm so grateful to her that she's taken the time out of her busy family time, busy, start of the school year to be with us today to talk through this. So for the next half an hour, 35 minutes or so, Jen and I are going to chat. We have some questions that we thought might prompt the conversation. And of course, we're hoping that you will give us some intriguing questions to join this as well. So welcome, Jen. Thank you so much for being with us.
Michelle, thank you. That was such a generous introduction, and always a delight to be able to spend time with you and to contribute to the important work that you're doing, and even in some small way. This is such an important bill, and this would not even be happening, right, were it not for the excellent work of Disability Without Poverty, as well as the entire community that I know is gathered here. So thank you.
Well, thank you too. So Tuesday, we have second reading, and we basically constantly hear that this is a framework bill. Can you tell us what's a framework bill?
Okay, so look, you've already given a really nice overview of the legislative process, and framework bills, just like other kinds of bills, those are the same steps they go through. Like, all legislation is treated the same. The way that we need to think about framework bill is that it outlines, it provides the outline, right, that it's going to be filled in. So in this case, it's instructing that Parliament says a benefit has to be created. It says this is what it should be called, Canada Disability Benefit. It says this is the minister who's responsible, so that's the assignment of Crown power. That's really important. It says what the benefit should do. So when you look at the preamble, for example, it makes reference to improving financial security and reducing poverty. That goal was super clear if you paid attention to the minister's speech early this week. And then it also assigns legal authorities to make the bill work, right? So it gives the authority to the responsible minister. So it'll be the Minister for Employment, Social Development, Minister Qualtrough currently, but whoever it is that is occupying that space later. It gives that person the authority to collect and use personal information like a social insurance number in order to be able to figure out to whom to pay the money. It also does things like protecting the Canada Disability Benefit from bankruptcy processes, that sort of thing. It says where the money is going to have to come from. So it says this is going to come out of what we call the Consolidated Revenue Fund, which is like the general pool from general taxation. So, that means unlike some other benefits and programs, we're not having to create a new revenue source from this, right? This is a collective responsibility of the government to fund this. And most importantly, I think, is that it creates a legal obligation. It says the minister must pay this benefit to people who are eligible. This is really key because this means this is a new statutory benefit. And what does that mean? if Parliament isn't sitting, if there's an election, the money continues flowing. It does not have to be renegotiated year after year in a federal budget. This isn't money that is subject to voting in Parliament, you know, on a cyclical basis. So that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing to make this statutory and to create an obligation. And then it says, the framework bill says, we're also going to outline a variety of other elements to the design of this benefit in regulations, right? So, you know, just to sort of think about this to give a contrast, there are pluses and minuses of doing a framework bill versus a very detailed bill. You know, one of the pluses would be we would know more about how much money are we talking about, what's the application process, how's eligibility going to be established, and all of that has been left to the regulations. Unlike things like the Canada Child Benefit, which some people on the line today might be familiar with. That's part of the Income Tax Act. And that legislation is really clear about setting what's the formula for how the benefit will be determined. You know, how often is it going to be adjusted for inflation? It defines eligibility in the law and how applications are to be made. But the downside is that when government wanted to try and do a top-up, you know, to families receiving the benefit during COVID, they didn't have the legal authority to make any changes, right? Because the regulations, the regulatory powers weren't there. So instead, they actually had to go through the whole legislative process that you just outlined, right? Those multiple steps to be able to do that. So look, framework legislation is frustrating in the sense of leaving so many unknowns, right? And so much left to the regulatory process. On the other hand, it does allow for flexibility while at the same time creating a legal obligation for government to pay this benefit. I think there were also some hints in the debate earlier this week about why the government has gone this route. You know, the minister talked about there's a really big intergovernmental challenge here in terms of negotiations with provinces and territories. And she mentioned this goal of harmonizing benefits. I think let's keep our eye on that space. But she also said that this was important to allow the disability community to have voice and be engaged. She even later used the term co-development. And you know, let's be clear. Like really, the details of this really should be through a process of co-design. Persons with disabilities need to be at the table, in the room, as the details are fleshed out.
Yeah, thank you so much. You said there that that gives me pause for thought, you know, because we've seen the government move really quickly at many times, right? We've seen like CERB is the best example that everyone can give. But, you know, CERB came and went. It served its purpose and it went. And we're trying to set up a benefit here that's going to be in perpetuity. And, you know, as much as we all want it to happen, like yesterday, when I start to see the income tax rules that have to be changed, and, you know, I've started myself, there's different scenarios that I've started to think through that it's like, well, wait a minute. And as you say, if all of that gets codified into law, if we realize that, you know, that there's been an error or heaven forbid, a pandemic comes along and we have to change things really quickly, it's just not that nimble. But at the same time, we all want to know. And I think that also, you know, we heard from I think Minister Qualtrough gave one of the most emotional speeches I've heard in Parliament. It seemed to me, it felt like the speech she'd been waiting to give for a long, long time, and, you know, to right wrongs. But it puts so much responsibility into those regulations. And I guess that's where that fear comes out, is that we feel that, you know, if it's in law, it's solid and it can't be changed, right? Which, as you said, has positives and negatives. But the regulations, they feel a little more like slippery. So, you know, what's involved in that regulatory process to give us an understanding that it's just not, you know, somebody coming up with a list of things and hey, that's what we're going to do.
No, it's not just somebody coming, at least, it should never be somebody just coming up with a list of things. So the law, any law, right, creates authorities for the government to make regulations that will, be set out in terms of the scope of that legislation. And Parliament doesn't have to vote on those, right? They've already voted in favor once a bill is passed and has reached royal assent. They've already said that the aims, the scope, and the authorities within the legislation are okay. And again, one of those authorities is to go ahead and make regulations. So regulations can either be passed or be the responsibility of the full cabinet, or they can be ministerial regulations, in which case it's up to the individual minister to shepherd that process and to be responsible for seeing it through to fruition. In either case, the process is basically the same. So officials for the ministers responsible for the legislation will take the lead normally in drafting proposals for what should go into the regulations according to the directions that have been set out in the law. There's a consultation process, and then lawyers in the Department of Justice will turn these into the draft regulations written, according to the legalese that they always do. Now, because C22 says that these regulations will be governor in council, so not just Minister Qualtrough, that also means that these regulations are going to have to be approved by the Treasury Board, it's a committee of the full cabinet. It's the only committee that cabinet has to create, and so they review all governor and council regulations. After the draft is approved by Treasury Board, then it gets printed in the government's official record, which is called the Canada Gazette. And that creates another window, which is legally required, by the way, for consultations and comments. Now, I omitted the part of the process that is actually really key, which is that as the officials are doing the initial draft proposals, they're supposed to be engaging in a consultation process before the lawyers come in and turn it all into, legal mumbo jumbo. And that consultation process for creating the proposal at the front end isn't actually prescribed, right? There is a great deal of flexibility in there. It can be formal or informal, public or not, but ultimately the input, has to be taken from, from the interested parties and turned into those draft proposals before they are passed. And again, as I said, even once they're drafted, they are printed and published, and there's an opportunity for people to have their voice heard then. But let me just say two more things about this. Regulations have what are called subjects and objects. That means they have to be clear about who they apply to, and they also have to be clear about what those people or bodies have to do to be in compliance. And so that means it's really important to engage with the people or the bodies who are going to be engaged in that delivery, right? My hope is, and this is one thing that would be worth calling for, frankly, I think publicly, to have government make greater commitments on this, to be transparent about how they intend to do that consultation process within the regulations, right? So the law is telling us there are going to have to be regulations in order to make this bill happen. This bill must happen, right? Or this benefit must happen if this bill is passed. But now we want a commitment to a process that is open and transparent, and not just kind of your bog standard regulatory process, right, with short turnaround times and no opportunity for true co-design. So let's keep, again, something to keep an eye on in terms of next steps.
So I just want to, as you talk about next steps and consultation, so we potentially have coming up committee in the House, and that's an opportunity, a small group of, obviously not everybody that gets to ask gets to speak to committee, but everybody can write in, everybody can send a written submission. So that's now, our next stage, hopefully really soon. Once it gets to the Senate, we have that again, and you can send in, and all of these, none of this goes away. It's all kept as part of the official record, right? And then you're saying that we now have this third consultation process that's not as formalized as the other two, are, right? As in some ways, right? Not, you know, that there's flexibility in the way that the government could choose to go through this in the regulatory process. So that's something really important for us as a disability community to get behind, to say that this is what we want. And then even when it goes into the Canada Gazette, there's another opportunity, right? So it's really important. And, you know, I know many organizations, we're doing our best to let people know of when things are going to come up. It's really important for people to say what they want and tell their story and tell them how we want them to hear our stories, which would be this next consultation, right? So that it gets into people's voices as much as possible. I'm just going to add in here a question that we've received. And the question is how do we make the CRPD, the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities, the cornerstone to the Canada Disability Benefit? You know, so for those who don't know, this is part of a UN convention that Canada signed on to, and so is meant to underpin everything that we do for disabled people. And it has, I forget how many clauses, and I'm sure somebody will tell us in the questions of the chat, but there are clauses that relate directly to dignity and quality of life and income and access to income. And so all of those clauses feed directly into what we would want a Canada Disability Benefit. So what's the government's responsibility to be looking at the UN Convention as this goes along?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So I guess
yeah, absolutely.
Let me say a couple of different things. I guess the first would be, I would strongly encourage anybody who's listening right now, and I've shared with the tech team a link to the website where you can read the current text of the bill and follow its progress through Parliament. In terms of engaging with the HUMA committee, you know, there's a way to, for example, send in those written briefs. Now, committee is kind of the first opportunity for the bill to be amended. So if there is a sense that this bill does not adequately reflect the government's obligations under that UN convention, then that is an important opportunity for the bill to be amended. You're right, the convention does relate to principles of dignity, individual autonomy, that's a really important one, right? And equality and inclusion. And so there ought to have been, before this bill was tabled, a part of the stage of drafting it that included a review for obligations under international treaties. That ought to, obviously, in this case, have included Canada, right? So it's not just this particular government or even the federal government, but frankly, Canada's
all
obligations, right, under CRPD. Now that's, you know, that is something in terms of people who have expertise in the convention. I would be encouraging folks on this call to engage with them and to raise these questions in terms of the review, the detailed review of the content of the bill, because after the stage of committee, when amendments are proposed to the bill, it goes back to, you know, the main House of Commons, and that's where they, you know, they vote on whether to adopt those amendments, and then that's kind of it, right? Like that's kind of our main window of opportunity here. So we have a window in terms of ensuring that those principles and compliance with CRPD would be reflected at least at the legislative stage.
Yeah, because, you know, I think as we'll move on to now, I think there's certain things that need to be enshrined in law, and there are certain things that the flexibility that you spoke to before, as happened with the child benefit, that we may need to be in we may prefer to be in the regulations, even though we may feel we want it to be law. So given what you've seen in the past, what are your thoughts on how the benefit will be designed? You know, how will the various components be considered? I know we have lots of questions on separate components, and there are some at DWP that we're, you know, particularly passionate about, and others, you know. So give us your thoughts as someone who's seen these things happen.
Right. So, the design of a benefit always has to do with the who, the what, the how, and the when, right? So figuring who will receive this, what amount are they going to receive, how are they going to receive it, and when, right? The when is also, it's the start date, but more than that as well. So let's maybe start with what we do know so far. So starting with looking at the purpose of C22, it's very clear, right? It has outlined poverty reduction and financial security as key aims and purposes of this goal for working age persons with disability. So in terms of thinking about the amount, the government has actually set itself a benchmark there of saying that this benefit has to be adequate enough to have a meaningful impact in reducing poverty. I would even point out that in the minister's speech or comments earlier this week, she actually raised the bar. She didn't just say reduce poverty. She said eliminate poverty for persons with disabilities, right? So I'm indirectly quoting there, but she did say, right, that's her objective, right, is to eliminate poverty for persons with disabilities in this country. So in terms of thinking about the benefit amount, right, the government has set itself this benchmark. So there will be analysis then in terms of various designs. What is the poverty reduction impact? Again, we also need to think about how we're measuring poverty here. Is it the government's own threshold of poverty for all Canadians, or do we need to be thinking about something that is more of a disability adjusted measure that recognizes that many persons with disabilities face unique extra expenses, right, in order to live with dignity and inclusion. So then let me come back to the who, right, the eligibility criteria. There will be multiple efforts to try and figure out working age adults. That's been sort of set up, but that now implies there's going to be a certain age parameter around this, right? Do we start with age 18, or do we start with a later date in terms of our definition? It does seem pretty clear this is probably likely to phase out at an upper age limit. More than likely, I would expect probably around age 64, given that government would say, well, there's other seniors related benefits that would then sort of pick up where the CBD would leave off. The law also does talk about eligibility, including persons with disabilities who have a legal representative, right? So now this is also telling us something about they're going to have to do some work to figure out how is that process going to work to ensure that legal representatives can access this benefit on behalf of a person with a disability while still respecting the principle of inclusion, dignity, and autonomy, right? There's obviously going to be an issue of defining disability. The bill says this is a benefit to be paid to working age adults, including those with a representative who have a disability. And identification of the disability is going to be key and really challenging. Now, this could kind of go one of a few ways. One way, and I think that this would be terrible, would be if the government were to say, we have a definition of disability that is already recognized in this other benefit, we'll just use that, right? And basically, if you qualify for this other benefit, then you can get this one too, as long as you meet the other eligibility criteria. But I think anybody who is on this call who has ever taken a look or had to navigate themselves the process, right? And frankly, it's a crowded space of disability benefits across the country, federal and provincial. And then when you get into private sector coverage for some workers, but not others. But it's a Swiss cheese space, right? Where a number of people are left out, right? So that's going to be an issue. So that would be one path that the government could take in saying, we will recognize disability if somebody is already eligible for this other thing over here. That's what government did when they created the Registered Disability Savings Plan. For expediency, they went with the disability tax credit, and I think that they've been living with regret, or ought to have been living with regret about that ever since. On eligibility, we also need to think about which federal body is going to be responsible for verifying this eligibility, right? Many people on this call will have been familiar with engaging with officials to access or maintain Canada Pension Plan disability benefits, or EI sickness, or dealing with having to prove that you are still eligible for the disability tax credit at CRA, or perhaps dealing with Veterans Affairs to be able to access a disability pension. So there's sort of, bits and pieces of capacity across the federal family, but no one central place. And frankly, they all have various pluses and minuses when it comes to their suitability to do this kind of work of working with people with disabilities.
So we're getting a lot of questions about eligibility, a lot of questions about a lot of things, but I think eligibility, and particularly, that we know that when this was first proposed, it was compared to GIS, and that OAS, GIS, and that there was, but that is the most simple, as I see it, relationship of benefits. First of all, the criteria is simple. You have a birthday and you become 65. Sorry for people. OAS is old age security, and GIS is guaranteed income supplement for those who need extra income. And the CDB, the Canada Disability Benefit, is being compared to that in its role as a supplement. However, the other piece here that people tend to get, as you say, is from all of these different places. So it's from provincial or territorial, the sorts of, in BC, we call it PWD for short, in AISH in Alberta, ODSP. But we know our friends in the Atlantic provinces don't even have a disability assistance payment like the rest of us, have us to. And those amounts are all different. Those procedures are all different. How's this going to work? How are we going to have this government supplement? How's the eligibility, the amounts? What's going to happen?
Wish I knew. Honestly,
Me too.
I wish I knew, but I could just tell you. Look, the design of new federal programs is always an interdepartmental exercise involving, in this case, it'll involve Minister Qualtrough's officials at ESDC. But depending on how this might be delivered, this may also require outreach, to other parts of government. Certainly the Department of Finance is going to be involved because, again, right, this has to be funded, right? And so the Department of Finance will want to be involved in terms of figuring out the budgeting around this, basically. Then there's also that intergovernmental element that you mentioned, so here I think Minister Qualtrough has been really clear about saying there's a big federal, provincial, territorial negotiation that will need to happen. And so just, to give some examples, one approach would be for the federal government just to say, it is a flat benefit amount, it is this amount, it is the fixed same amount for everybody who qualifies. Let's just set aside the issue of how do you qualify and eligibility. I will come back to that, but it's the same amount for everybody. But then that would be like, let's think about a layered cake, right? That would be layered on top of very different things for very different persons. And, for example, if you're a single on ODSP here in Ontario, you're getting, a maximum all in from all sources of about $14,000, sort of 15,000 after a few other credits. But if you're in BC, it's a very different amount. So, when you add another layer on top of that, the goal here of treatment of people that is dignified, inclusive, and also does the poverty reduction, right? This is going to require some finessing, right? Some negotiations, both with provinces and territories, but also across the federal bodies themselves. In terms of eligibility, I think it's worth paying very close attention to whether this will be a benefit that is individual or family uncontested, if it's going to be uncontested. So let's assume it's not going to be just a flat amount for everybody, no matter your circumstances, but in fact, it will be uncontested in some way. Is that going to be tested on the basis of your adjusted family income, which is how we run things like child benefits and the GST credit, or will it be related to individual income, recognizing that it's individuals, right? It's individual working age adults that have the disability. And if one of the principles that we want to see in this benefit from that convention is respect for individual autonomy, then to my mind, at least my way of thinking, that demands that this is an individual benefit rather than family uncontested, because wouldn't it be terrible, right, to meet all of the other eligibility criteria and to find yourself in a circumstance that you won't get it because your spouse's income is
you
too high.
You just rolled straight into one of our earlier questions that had come in from somebody. And also one of the things that for many of us in the disability community is so key, because it's been one of the conversations that I've had with politicians that and bureaucrats that's been the kind of hardest to get across. And I take it back to this basic idea that, imagine, you're born with a disability. Are you saying that that person will never have their own independent, autonomous income? Because if you're saying that it's means tested across the family of some sort, that's what you're saying. When it comes to people's safety, right? When people want to leave, unfortunately, abusive relationships and their money is tied up. But the other thing that we see, and we kind of call, it's been known as the right to live and the right to love, is when disabled people want to be together with, another disabled person or non-disabled person in a relationship, they often find that they lose, right? That the amount they get is decreased, and that they lose goods and services that come along with it as well. So, this whole, now, as I see it, our provinces, apart from a couple, all our provinces, tend to work on this means tested basis. However, our federal benefits like CPPD, EI, they operate on an individualized basis. So, gaze into your crystal ball for me. Like, what do you think's going to happen there?
So, look, this is where hopefully good policy process in terms of that regulatory process that we talked about earlier, that is transparent, that is not just consultative in terms of, hey, we've designed a thing, tell us what you think about it, but actually inclusionary, right? Actually brings people who have disabilities into the design process and is ethical as well. I mean, hopefully that will result in a benefit design that is consistent with those CRDP principles and is consistent in living up to the purpose and intent that is laid out, that ambitious purpose and intent that is laid out in this legislation. There's always going to be a push and pull between benefit design that is more inclusive, more responsive, more equitable, more fair, and benefit design that is easier, right? Easier to implement, maybe costs less on a regular basis. But my hope is that we have good process so we get to better outcomes, at least with this benefit design. There would be a push, I think, on income testing, perhaps from some quarters, to try and make this family uncontested, similar to other benefits that federal officials might be familiar with. But as you've laid out, there's a very good case for making this individual in terms of its nature. So, crystal ball, what do I think is going to happen? I don't know, Michelle. I wish I had.
No, I wish we did. I wish we had for so many of these, because as we talk about means tested and so on, another massive fear for disabled people is clawbacks, right? And so, and how do we work through this in the best ways for us possibly to ensure that disabled people in some way do not end up worse off? Because, as you've heard me say before, I think that it's very easy to not have financial clawbacks, but for us all to keep the eye on the ball, that none of those goods and services get clawed back, that without which, disabled people simply can't function. I guess I don't really have a question for you here. I'm just saying that we're all really concerned as we get into this, that the Swiss cheese gets more holes in it rather than less holes, right? So
absolutely, and that's where the federal provincial negotiations that need to happen will be critical. So in terms of keeping your community of stakeholders active and involved and engaged, this is also going to require a focus on provincial audience as well, so that they understand the key role that they have there.
So just going back to that debate, second reading that happened, here's a question from that someone's posed. Given that there's agreement in principle, right? We constantly heard all parties present agreed, which was wonderful, right? I mean, what more could we want? It's frustrating, but wonderful. Is it in our best interest to push for some amendments to get some minimal characteristics? Like the examples here are like percentage eligible population into the law, or not? What are the risks?
Right. Look, I would say, think about what you absolutely need this bill to do. You need this bill to create the obligation of the government to pay a benefit. You need it to set out at a high level the clear principles regarding the purpose of the bill and who it ought to apply to. I understand the desire to see legislated objectives included. So for example, you know, the benefit must result in coverage for at least X percentages of persons with disabilities. I would just add perhaps a note of caution. You certainly can do that. There are, for example, legislated targets for poverty reduction that are in place federally, provincially as well. What I have not seen, though, is much by way of evidence that legislated targets necessarily result in better policy design, or frankly, even better compliance by policymakers in ensuring that in truth, right, those goals are met on time, but also in the way that the stakeholder community would want to see happen. So I guess my one concern would be, depending on the nature of the amendment, it could result in the bill slowing down. But if it's a really critically important amendment, that's worth it, because it's important to get this right. But there is no such thing as a perfect bill. And let's just be careful about, or thoughtful at least, reflective about, what do we think is absolutely essential to be in this bill.
So, you know, you mentioned the poverty, you know, reduction, elimination, all of those words of poverty. And I think there's some really important, like, sort of factual pieces there, right? That in Canada, we have no one poverty line, right? A lot of the time we think that it's $2,000 because that's what CERB was, and it's kind of an easy shortcut. But Canada's official poverty line has over 50 poverty lines in it, because it's based on different communities and all kinds of things. So I've seen suggestions of amendments that says that it has to meet what's called the, as you know, the market basket measure, the thing that measures this poverty line. You know, and that level of complexity seems to me to be something that, yes, if we're going to talk about poverty elimination, that's what we're talking about, getting above, you know, people who have heard me speak and know what I'm going to say next. It's no lollipops and rainbows at the poverty line, but at least it's better than being at half of the poverty line or less, as people are now. But that level of complexity to make that happen, is the government capable of doing that?
Let me add another level of complexity. The MBM, the market basket measure, the poverty line, it depends on where you live, the size of the community that you're in, and the size of the household that you're in. So it's very complex, and there are multiple factors in there that at the end of the day don't necessarily translate well to a benefit that we want to be inclusive, accessible, right? We don't want to have a huge amount of administrative burden that makes it difficult for people to prove that they are eligible for it, or that takes a really long time to figure out how much it ought to be, because there are all these, you know, multiple factors to to take into account. So we want a bill that is, we want a benefit, right, that will be adequate, and perhaps the benchmark for measuring its impact against the poverty line, and again, recognizing the drawbacks of using the same standard market basket measure for persons with disabilities. But maybe that's about measuring how well it's performing once we actually have a benefit in place.
Right, because one of the things that we know is that within Canada's population that lives in poverty, disabled people are twice as represented. So I know that for those people in government that dealing with those numbers is, what they do, as you say, following those metrics and so on. Lifting disabled people out of poverty can deal with one of the government's major targets, major responsibilities, by, some people have said, up to 50%, right? If they get it right. So that there's for all there is the dire need of our community for the government, for things that they've already got in place, there are really good reasons for them to get this right, to meet their own standards, right? If we look at it in such a black and white way. I think we're really getting close to start to run out of time. And, before I forget, thank you. This has been illuminating. And to all of the people, I can see on my screen the numbers of questions, and I hope that we've touched on some of the things to do with the Canada Disability Benefit as best as we possibly can. But we've had so many questions come in, and we will perhaps try and follow up with this by answering, in a written format, put it on our website or something like that in the future. I'm not promising it'll be fast, but we will do the best we can to make sure that people feel that that our questions are getting answered. So here's the big crystal ball question. When do you think, realistically, given all of this complexity we've spent the last 45 minutes talking about, when do you think people could start receiving it?
I'm also conscious of some of the comments in the chat that are popping up on my screen, and I understand the frustration and impatience and desperation for many people that are really struggling, and this help can't arrive fast enough. My answer is not at all based on what I would like to happen, but just what I have seen happen in terms of how government works. The bill passes, then we have the regulatory process that we talked about, and then government has to figure out how to implement, right? Which part of government is going to run this? Do they need to hire people? Do they need new systems like ways to accept applications, to track who got paid what? They're going to need to have ways to actually communicate with people who have questions or who need assistance to complete application forms. They're going to have a process where if somebody feels that they haven't been treated fairly, there has to be fair process and opportunities to appeal decisions. And, after all of that, then we see rollout, right? So we've got 50 sitting days left in this calendar year for the House of Commons. I think with strong push and cross-party cooperation, it's not impossible to imagine that we could get the bill through to the Senate by that time. Beyond that, it's a little tougher to say. Employment insurance changes, just to give a parallel, normally work on about 6 to 18 months of lead time. Income tax changes, usually about the same amount of time, 6 to 18 months. But I would just add an important asterisk there. Those are for programs that are long-standing, that are using systems that have existed for decades. This is something that's entirely new. And so it's really important to get it right. This is something that has to be done right, transparently, and inclusively. So we want government to hurry. We don't want government to rush, if that makes any sense.
Those are excellent words. We want them to hurry, but we don't want them to rush. And I think, thank you for that. I think those are words that I will try to remember as, we constantly push for this to be fast-tracked. So can I say thank you very much to you. And can I say thank you very much to all the support team, to everybody who's been here, to as participants, to all of our interpreters and CART and so on, and to everybody that submitted a question. We do need to keep this pressure going. And I know that we are all here for the long haul. If you live close to Ottawa and you are able to, join us for a rally on Parliament Hill on Wednesday, October the 19th. We do need your help to keep this pressure on. Details of this, I can tell you it's going to start at noon. Details of this will be available through all Disability Without Poverty website, newsletter, social media as we get close to that day. But for all of you who are anywhere near Parliament Hill, please come and join us and make sure that we continue to raise our voices. What can you do? Well, right now, today, you can contact your MP. You can call them and email them. If you are a constituent, you can ask for a meeting and tell them to fast track this. We also have a system set up, sorry if you could just go back, where all the tools are made available for you to email your MP. Let them know about your situation. Let them know their frustrations as this process. And if you go onto our website, disabilitypoverty.ca /ask your MP, you will find, well, you'll find the link on the website. You'll find all the tools there to help you. And that's an action that you can all take today. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Please, let's all stay connected. On the screen right now, we're giving all of the ways that you can stay connected with us at Disability Without Poverty. The website, disabilitywithoutpoverty.ca. You can email us, hello@disabilitywithoutpoverty.ca. You can find us on Twitter, where our handle is disability_WP, and on Facebook by looking for Disability Without Poverty. We really want to hear from you. We may not be able to use your name, your individual story, but let me just tell you, you go with us in every meeting we have, every letter that we write to officials, all of your stories, all of your concerns go with us as we talk to everybody, and that we continue to put this pressure on. Thank you all for joining us today, and please stay with us as we all go together on this course for this journey to lift our disabled people out of poverty. Thank you very much.